The radio crackled to life in the pre-dawn darkness of June 3, 1942. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, Commander Wade McCluskey pressed his headphones closer, straining to hear through the static that threatened to drown out the urgent transmission from Pearl Harbor. What he heard made his blood run cold. Japanese fleet moving toward Midway. Massive force. This is not a drill. 6 months have passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like a conquering tsunami. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor's destruction, now set his sights on Midway Atoll's strategic coral outcropping that served as America's westernmost naval base. The tiny island, barely 2 miles long, had become the linchpin in Japan's grand strategy to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific once and for all. Yamamoto's plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. He would deploy the largest naval armada in history, over 200 ships, including 4 aircraft carriers of the elite First Air Fleet, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. The Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soryu carried between them nearly 300 of Japan's finest aircraft, piloted by veterans who had carved a path of destruction from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. The Admiral's strategy was deceptively simple: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet to Midway, then annihilate it in a decisive battle that would force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. But Yamamoto had underestimated American resolve and ingenuity. Deep beneath the hills of Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptographers led by Commander Joseph Rockford worked around the clock in a converted basement they called the dungeon. These unsung heroes had achieved what many thought impossible. They had cracked the Japanese naval code through painstaking analysis of intercepted communications. They had pieced together the enemy's intentions. The Japanese were coming to Midway, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, intended to be ready for them. The American response was born of desperation and courage. Nimitz could muster only 3 aircraft carriers against Yamamoto's 4, and his pilots were largely inexperienced compared to their battle-hardened Japanese counterparts. The USS Yorktown, severely damaged in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, limped into Pearl Harbor's dry dock on May 27th. Navy engineers estimated 3 months for repairs, but Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working in shifts around the clock, welders and engineers performed what could only be described as a miracle, patching hull plates and rewiring damaged systems with a speed that defied all naval construction precedent. As the Yorktown prepared for what many believed would be her final voyage, Admiral Raymond Spruance took command of Task Force 16 aboard the Enterprise. The weight of the Pacific War rested on his shoulders, though few realized it at the time. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese success at Midway would open the door to attacks on Hawaii itself, potentially forcing America to defend its own western coast. The stakes could not have been higher. Historical context reference from Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, which documented the crucial intelligence breakthrough that made the American victory possible. On the evening of June 2nd, as the American fleet steamed westward through increasingly rough seas, sailors aboard the 3 carriers wrote letters home, knowing they might be their last. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, dark and foreboding under a canopy of stars that seemed to mock the insignificance of the human drama unfolding below. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or catastrophe, but tonight belonged to prayer and preparation. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Midway Atoll on June 4th, 1942. At exactly 6:28 in the morning, radar operator Private Joseph McDonald spotted the first wave of enemy aircraft. On his primitive scope of formation so large, it appeared as a solid mass of blips moving inexorably toward the tiny island. Within minutes, air raid sirens wailed across Midway as 108 Japanese dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes descended from the northwest like mechanical vultures. Lieutenant Colonel Arakines led Midway's meager air defenses. Into the maelstrom, his squadron of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, derisively nicknamed Flying Coffins by their pilots, climbed desperately to intercept the Japanese formation. The ensuing aerial combat was savage and brief. The experienced Japanese pilots, flying Superior Zero fighters, methodically destroyed nearly every defending aircraft. Combs himself was shot down over the lagoon, his Buffalo exploding in a ball of orange flame that reflected off the coral beneath. The bombing of Midway was devastating but not decisive. Japanese bombs cratered the airfield and destroyed buildings, but the island's crucial installations remain operational. More importantly, the attack had revealed the location of the Japanese strike force to American reconnaissance aircraft. Lieutenant Howard 80, flying a lumbering PBY Catalina patrol bomber, transmitted the coordinates that would change the course of the war to carriers and battleships. Bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles, course southeast, speed 25 knots. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force from the bridge of the Akagi, faced a crucial decision as his aircraft returned from Midway. His pilots reported that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the American base. Simultaneously, his reconnaissance aircraft had failed to locate the American fleet, which intelligence suggested might not even be in the area. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft, armed with armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second attack on Midway. This decision would prove fatal, as Japanese ordnance crews frantically switched bomb loads on the crowded hangar decks. American torpedo bombers from the three carriers were already airborne and racing toward the Japanese fleet. The first to arrive were 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet, led by Commander John Waldron. Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot known for his aggressive tactics, had spent the previous evening studying intelligence reports and plotting the most direct course to intercept the enemy. Torpedo Squadron 8's attack was a study in heroic futility. The slow, lumbering Devastators approached the Japanese fleet at wave top level, making them easy targets for both fighter planes and anti-aircraft fire. Zero fighters swooped down like hawks, their machine guns chattering death. One by one, the American torpedo bombers exploded or crashed into the Pacific's unforgiving waters. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall. Struck by cannon fire that sent it cartwheeling into the sea in a spray of foam and twisted metal. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators were destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket amid the debris of his shattered aircraft. Watching the battle unfold from the water, the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 appeared meaningless. Not a single torpedo had found its target, but their attack had accomplished something crucial. It had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the enemy carriers vulnerable to dive bomber attack. Combat details corroborated by official U.S. Navy action reports archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, which provide first-hand accounts of the aerial engagements. High above the carnage, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bombers in a desperate search for the Japanese fleet, low on fuel and facing the possibility of ditching in the ocean. McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. Gambling that the ship was heading toward the main fleet, he followed its course. At exactly 10:22 in the morning, the clouds parted to reveal the most beautiful sight any American pilot had seen in 6 months of war. For Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The moment a decision had arrived. For carriers against three, experience against desperation, empire against republic. In the next few minutes, the fate of the Pacific War would be determined by the courage of young men diving through flak-filled skies toward an enemy that had never known defeat. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's voice crackled through the radio static as his SBD Dauntless dive bombers reached their attack position for miles above the Japanese fleet. Attack, attack, remember Pearl Harbor. The words would echo through naval history as 37 American dive bombers rolled into near-vertical dives toward the carrier Akagi, flagship of Admiral Nagumo's once invincible First Air Fleet. The scene below was chaos incarnate. Japanese aircraft crowded the carrier decks, their fuel lines sneaking across wooden planking while ordnance crews scrambled to arm aircraft for the second strike on Midway. Aviation gasoline pooled on the flight decks, creating a volatile mixture that needed only a spark to transform these floating cities into floating funeral pyres. Admiral Nagumo, veteran of countless battles, watched in horror as American dive bombers materialized from the high clouds like avenging angels. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his primary target. At an altitude of 14,000 feet, he pushed his Dauntless into a screaming dive, the aircraft's perforated dive brakes creating a distinctive shriek that Japanese sailors would later describe as the sound of approaching death. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the formation. creating a deadly curtain of steel and explosive that filled the sky with deadly fragments. Best 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just after the forward elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. The detonation triggered a chain reaction of secondary explosions as aviation fuel ignited and ordnance cooked off. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a blazing inferno. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform cinched and his flagship dying beneath his feet, was forced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked the carrier Soryu. Leslie's own bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned during the dive, but his wingmen pressed home their attacks with devastating accuracy. 3 bombs struck the Soryu in rapid succession, turning her hangar deck into a hellish furnace. The carrier's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of survival, last seen standing on his bridge, as flames consumed his command. The third victim of what Japanese historians would later call the 5 minutes that changed the world was the carrier Kaga. Bombs from both Enterprise and Yorktown aircraft found their mark on the massive carrier, which had been converted from a battleship hull in the 1920s. Her thick armor, designed to withstand naval gunfire, proved useless against bombs that penetrated her flight deck and exploded in her aircraft-packed hangar bays. The Kaga became a floating volcano, her ammunition magazines detonating in explosions that could be heard 20 miles away in the span of 5 minutes. From 10:24 to 10:29 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted decisively. 3 of Japan's first-line aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced aircrews trapped below decks or floating dead in the oil-slicked waters. Around their ships, the Akagi, which had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was abandoned at 7:25 that evening and scuttled by Japanese destroyers, rather than allow her to fall into American hands. Timing and tactical details verified through the comprehensive analysis in Gordon Prange's Miracle at Midway, which utilized both American and Japanese primary sources to reconstruct the battle's crucial moments, but the battle was far from over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiru, had been separated from the main formation and escaped the initial American attack. Counter-Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from the Hiryu's bridge, immediately launched every available aircraft in a desperate bid for revenge. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off the Hiryu's deck, their destination the American task force that had just dealt the Imperial Navy its first major defeat since the Battle of the Yellow Sea in 19 for as the Japanese strike force winged toward the American fleet. Damage control parties aboard the 3 burning carriers fought heroically to save their ships. On the Akagi, engine room crews remained at their posts even as temperatures soared above human endurance, keeping the carrier's engines running so she could maintain formation speed. Their sacrifice was ultimately fuel. The fires had progressed too far to be contained, but their courage exemplified the warrior spirit that had made the Imperial Navy a feared opponent. The American fleet, riding high on the euphoria of their stunning success, now faced the sobering reality that the battle was entering its second phase. Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, knew that Japanese retaliation was inevitable. His radar operators strained their equipment to its limits, searching for the approaching enemy strike. The hunters had become the hunted, and the afternoon would test American resolve as severely as the morning had tested Japanese invincibility. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly down on the Pacific as 18 Japanese dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters from the carrier Hiru approached the American task force. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the strike, had watched his 3 sister carriers burn that morning from the Hiryu's flight deck. Now, with the bitter taste of defeat fresh in his mouth, he guided his formation toward what he hoped would be vengeful redemption. Through his binoculars, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of American carriers, cutting white wakes through the blue-black ocean. Aboard the USS Yorktown, radar operator Elliot Buckmaster tracked the approaching enemy formation with growing alarm. Bogies bearing 270, distance 46 miles, closing fast, he reported to the bridge. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from the Yorktown, had anticipated this moment. His carrier had already survived 1 battle in the Coral Sea. Now she would face her second trial by fire in less than a month. The Yorktown's combat air patrol led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, climbed desperately to intercept the Japanese strike. Thatch, inventor of the revolutionary Thatch Weave fighter tactic, deployed his Wildcat fighters in a defensive pattern designed to maximize their firepower against the more maneuverable Zero fighters. The aerial combat that followed was a masterpiece of tactical innovation versus experienced aggression. At exactly 4 to 5 in the afternoon, Kobayashi's dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. The Yorktown, nicknamed the Fighting Lady by her crew, twisted and turned in violent evasive maneuvers as her anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly flak. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the carrier's commanding officer, ordered maximum speed as his ship heeled over and turned so sharp that aircraft on the hangar deck broke loose from their restraints. 3 bombs found their target. The first struck the flight deck near the number 1 elevator, blasting a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The second penetrated the smokestack, disrupting the carrier's ventilation system and filling her interior spaces with acrid smoke. The third bomb exploded in the number 1 boiler room, killing every man on watch and reducing the Yorktown's speed to a crawling 6 knots. For most ships, such damage would have spelled doom, but the Yorktown's damage control teams, trained to a level of efficiency that bordered on the miraculous, immediately set to work. Within an hour, they had patched the flight deck with steel plates, restored partial ventilation, and brought the boilers back online. By 4:20 in the afternoon, the carrier was launching aircraft again, her speed restored to 20 knots. The Japanese pilots, returning to the Hiru, reported the Yorktown sunk. This intelligence error would prove crucial, as it led the Japanese to believe they faced only 2 operational American carriers, instead of 3. When the Hiru launched her second strike at 4:10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters, they expected to finish off a crippled force, not engage a fully operational carrier task force. Damage control procedures and timeline documented in the official USS Yorktown Action Report, filed with the Bureau of Ships and preserved in the National Archives, providing detailed technical information about the carrier's remarkable recovery. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led this second strike, knowing it would likely be his last mission. His fuel tank had been holed by American gunfire during the morning attack on Midway, making his return to the Hiru impossible. As his formation approached the American fleet, he transmitted a final message to Admiral Yamaguchi: "Will make torpedo attack. Recommend Admiral launch all remaining aircraft for second attack." The torpedo attack on the Yorktown was devastating in its precision. The torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her forward engine room and causing a severe list that made flight operations impossible. This time, even the Yorktown's legendary damage control teams could not work their magic quickly enough. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was beyond immediate salvation, ordered abandoned ship at 3 o'clock. But while the Japanese were concentrating their remaining strength against the Yorktown, American dive bombers from the Enterprise were already airborne and hunting for the Hiru. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading Bombing Squadron 6, had located the last operational Japanese carrier at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The Hiru, sailing alone and desperate, represented Japan's final hope of salvaging something from the disaster that had befallen the First Air Fleet. 24 SPD Dauntless dive bombers screamed down through moderate anti-aircraft fire toward the Hiru's flight deck. The Japanese carrier, smaller and more maneuverable than her larger sisters, twisted through violent evasive maneuvers that threw her crew against bulkheads and scattered equipment across her decks. But her luck had run out, for bombs struck in rapid succession, turning her hangar deck into the same kind of inferno that had consumed the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, for the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest aircraft carriers were burning or sunk. The First Air Fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been reduced to escort vessels and destroyers. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving damage reports aboard his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, realized that his grand strategy had not merely failed, it had resulted in catastrophe. The phoenix of Japanese naval aviation, which had risen from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to threaten Allied positions across the Pacific, was burning on the waters east of Midway Atoll. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato as the first reports of the carrier battle reached his flagship. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months, watched his prophecy fulfill itself with devastating accuracy. Through the humid darkness of the tropical night, he could see the distant orange glow on the horizon, where 4 of his fleet carriers burned like funeral pyres on the Black Ocean. The magnitude of the disaster became clear as surviving aircraft limped back to the few remaining Japanese ships capable of recovering them. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, now found himself aboard a destroyer, rescued from the flaming wreckage of the Akagi. As he briefed Yamamoto on the day's catastrophic events, the admiral's weathered face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the weight of defeat settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The enemy possessed far more accurate intelligence than we anticipated, Fukuda reported, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. They were waiting for us, positioned perfectly to intercept our striking force. Our losses are. He paused, struggling with the words. All 4 fleet carriers of the 1st Air Fleet are destroyed or beyond salvage. We have lost over 300 aircraft and most of our experienced aircrew. The loss of pilots was perhaps more devastating than the loss of ships. Japan's naval aviation program had spent years training the men who had made the 1st Air Fleet the most feared naval force in the world. These irreplaceable veterans, who had perfected their skills in combat over China and refined their tactics in the attack on Pearl Harbor, now floated dead in the waters around Midway or lay trapped in the twisted wreckage of their carriers. Hangar decks, Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomu Yugaki, urged his commander to continue the operation using the powerful surface fleet. That still remained intact. The Yamato loaned mounted 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever constructed, and was accompanied by a formidable force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. We can still bombard Midway into submission and occupy the atoll, Yugaki argued. The American fleet has also suffered losses. But Yamamoto understood what his subordinate did not. The Battle of Midway had been won and lost. In the skies, not on the surface, without air cover. His remaining ships would be sitting targets for American land-based aircraft, operating from Midway itself, as well as any remaining carrier aircraft. The admiral, who had once said that air power would dominate future naval warfare, now faced the bitter reality of his own prediction. Strategic assessment based on the classified Japanese naval records, translated in the reports of General MacArthur series, which provide insight into high-level Japanese decision-making during the battle's aftermath. At 11:50 in the evening of June 4th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that effectively ended Japan's 6-month period of Pacific dominance. Cancel the Midway operation. All forces will withdraw immediately. The message was received with stunned disbelief throughout the Japanese fleet. Many officers had expected to wake up on June 5th as conquerors of America's westernmost stronghold. Instead, they found themselves in full retreat. Meanwhile, aboard the American fleet, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. The USS Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, had become the focus of desperate salvage efforts. Captain Buckmaster, who had ordered his crew to abandon ship the previous afternoon, now led a salvage party back aboard his battered carrier. Working through the night, by the light of battle lanterns, damage control teams pumped out flooded compartments and attempted to restore power to vital systems. The Yorktown's resurrection seemed possible until dawn on June 6th, when the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen surrounding the crippled carrier. Tanabe, who had been stalking the American fleet for 2 days, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the slow-moving target to struck the Yorktown, sealing her fate, while a 3rd torpedo struck the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing power and pumping assistance. The Hammond broke in half and sank within 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding. As she went down and killing many of her crew who had already abandoned ship, the Yorktown, her back finally broken by the 2nd torpedo attack, rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, taking with her the lives of brave men who had fought to save their ship until the very end. But even this final Japanese success could not mask the enormity of their defeat, as Admiral Spruance's task force steamed eastward toward Pearl Harbor, carrying the wounded and the triumphant survivors of history's most decisive naval battle. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. Japan's offensive capability had been broken at Midway. From this point forward, the Imperial Navy would fight a defensive war against an increasingly powerful American force. The reckoning was complete. The 6 months of Japanese supremacy that Yamamoto had predicted were over, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun. The hospital ship USS Solace steamed slowly toward Pearl Harbor through the pre-dawn darkness of June 8, 1942, her white hull gleaming under a coat of fresh paint that could not quite hide the battle scars beneath. In her cramped medical bay, Seaman First Class George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, lay recovering from his ordeal in the waters off Midway. Through a porthole, he could see the lights of Oahu growing brighter on the horizon, a sight that 6 months earlier had been shrouded in the smoke and flames of Japanese bombs. Gay's survival had been nothing short of miraculous. For 30 hours, he had floated in his life jacket among the debris of the Japanese fleet, watching the battle unfold from his unique vantage point in the water. He had seen the dive bombers tear apart the enemy carriers, witnessed the death throes of the mighty Akagi, and observed the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Now, as the only man who could tell the complete story of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice, he carried the weight of 15 dead comrades on his conscience. Admiral Chester Nimitz waited on the pier at Pearl Harbor as the first ships from the victorious fleet began to arrive. The commander of the Pacific Fleet had gambled everything on the intelligence provided by his codebreakers, deploying his 3 operational carriers against a superior Japanese force in what many had considered a suicide mission. Now, as damage reports and casualty figures reached his headquarters, he began to comprehend the magnitude of the victory. His forces had achieved. The numbers told a story that would reshape the entire Pacific War. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 experienced naval personnel, including many of their most skilled pilots and aircrew. American losses, while significant, were a fraction of the Japanese toll: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men killed in action. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered forever. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, recovering from his injuries aboard a Japanese hospital ship bound for Yokosuka Naval Base, reflected bitterly on the reversal of fortune that had befallen his nation's forces 6 months earlier. He had led the air attack that devastated Pearl Harbor, striking the first blow in what Japanese leaders had confidently predicted would be a short, victorious war. Now, as he contemplated the wreckage of the First Air Fleet, he understood that Japan's brief moment of supremacy in the Pacific had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Post-battle analysis drawn from official U.S. Navy strategic assessments compiled in United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the war against Japanese transportation, which evaluated the long-term impact of the Midway victory on Japanese naval capabilities. The strategic implications of the Battle of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japanese shipyards, already stretched to capacity, would require years to replace the lost carriers, and the training programs needed to replace the experienced aircrew would take even longer. Meanwhile, American industrial production was reaching its wartime peak, with new Essex-class carriers rolling down the waves at an unprecedented rate. The numerical balance that had favored Japan at the war's beginning was shifting rapidly in America's favor. Emperor Hirohito, receiving the first reports of the disaster in his palace in Tokyo, summoned his military advisors for an emergency conference. The man whom his subjects regarded as a living god now faced the sobering reality that his empire's expansion had reached its absolute limit. The conquest of Midway was to have been followed by the invasion of Hawaii and potentially even attacks on the American West Coast. Instead, Japan would now be forced to defend conquests that were becoming increasingly difficult to supply and reinforce. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt read the victory dispatches with quiet satisfaction. The man who had led America into war following Pearl Harbor now saw the first clear evidence that the tide was turning in the Pacific. The victory at Midway, combined with the successful defense of Australia at the Battle of the Coral Sea, had provided the breathing space America needed to mobilize its industrial might for the long campaign ahead. The Battle of Midway had lasted for days, but its consequences would echo through the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War. Japanese naval forces, once the terror of Allied convoys and garrison forces from Hawaii to Australia, would never again possess the strength to mount a major offensive operation. The initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and with it came the certainty that American forces would eventually fight their way Across the Pacific to Japan itself died as the sun set on June 8, 1942, painting the waters around Pearl Harbor in shades of gold and crimson. The survivors of the Battle of Midway could reflect on their achievement with justifiable pride. They had fought the most important naval battle in American history and won a victory that made ultimate triumph in the Pacific possible. The long road to Tokyo Bay stretched ahead, but the direction of that road had been determined forever in the skies above a tiny coral atoll called Midway, where American courage and Japanese overconfidence had collided with consequences that changed the course of world history. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back.